Welcome. Tonight, we follow the quiet footsteps of a Roman gladiator. Not a legend, not a name in a book, just one man, rising before the sun, training through dust and silence, until the day his name disappears into the sand. If you enjoy these slow journeys through time, feel free to like, subscribe, or just listen as you drift off. Let's begin. The air inside the cell was still and heavy. It smelled of dust, old leather, and the slow decay of too many men sleeping too close for too many nights. Marcellus lay on a thin mat of straw, his arms crossed over his chest like he was already preparing for the afterlife. He wasn't dead, of course. Just tired in advance. Outside the small barred window, the sky was a deep grey blue, that hour between night and dawn when the world forgets what it's supposed to be. And for a few minutes, the Ludus, the gladiator school, was quiet. No shouts, no footsteps, just the hush of men pretending to still be asleep, because it wasn't quite time yet to admit the day had begun. Marcellus blinked at the ceiling. A spider was making what he could only assume was its sixth attempt at an architectural masterpiece in the corner above his bed. He admired the persistence. "Maybe they'll throw you into the arena next," he whispered to it. The spider, wisely, did not respond. With a slow breath, he sat up. His back cracked in 3 distinct places, like an old door opening, the kind you don't trust to close properly afterward. He stood and stretched, his bare feet pressing into the cool stone floor. A sliver of light crept in through the bars, drawing a pale stripe across his shoulder. Nearby, others stirred. A cough, a yawn that turned into a quiet groan. The rustle of fabric as one man rolled over and immediately decided against waking up. Marcellus didn't speak. No one did, really. Not at this hour. Words were for later, when they were swinging wooden swords at each other and pretending it didn't hurt. Now, the silence was sacred. He reached for the small bowl of water beside his mat and splashed some across his face. It was cold. The kind of cold that made your teeth threaten to resign. But it did the job. He was awake now. He dressed in his tunic, cinching it at the waist with a worn leather belt. The fabric was stiff from too many washings and not enough actual soap. He ran his hands over his arms, checking the bruises from the day before. A yellowing one on his shoulder, a darker one on his ribs, one on his shin that he didn't remember earning, possibly the result of losing an argument with a practice shield. The cell door creaked open, and the first light of day spilled into the corridor. It wasn't a grand sunrise, just enough light to see your own mistakes with. They would eat soon, a quick bowl of barley mush and a crust of bread if they were lucky. Not that anyone was here for the cuisine. A few muttered greetings passed between the men, more nods than words. Marcellus exhaled through his nose and rubbed his eyes. He didn't know what day it was, but it was training day. That much was certain. It was always training day, unless it was fight day, which frankly made training day look like a nice holiday with friends. He walked slowly toward the open corridor, the cool air brushing against his skin. Behind him, the spider was still at work. Marcellus glanced up once more. Try not to get crushed when they knock this place down in 100 years. The spider, in what could only be interpreted as a deeply Roman shrug, kept spinning, and with that, he stepped out of the cell and into the day. The corridor was cool and dim, lined with flickering oil lamps tucked into simple wall niches. Their light moved gently across the stone, casting long shadows that swayed like ghosts rehearsing a slow dance. Marcellus walked in silence. His sandals slapped softly against the stone, a rhythm he no longer noticed. Ahead, the bathroom waited. A generous word, really. It was less bath, and more large shared disappointment involving buckets. Inside, a few men were already splashing cold water over their chests with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for tax collection. One grunted as a handful hit his neck. Another muttered something about cursed pipes, though there were no pipes, just jars, buckets, and the eternal optimism of men who'd never once found the water warm. Marcellus approached his own basin. He dipped in a rag, pulled it out, and pressed it against his face. The cold shocked his senses in the usual way, 1,000 tiny reminders that yes, he was still alive, for now. He wiped slowly, over the eyes, behind the ears, the back of the neck. Sand always found its way in, no matter how careful you were. A part of him suspected it was the same sand every day, just rearranged, ancient and petty. Beside the basins, a cracked mirror hung on the wall, polished bronze that had long stopped pretending it was helpful. Marcellus glanced into it anyway, as he always did. His face stared back, tired eyes, shaved head, a faint scar that curved across his brow like an old note left in the margins. Not handsome, not frightening, just solid. He straightened his shoulders and muttered a soft prayer to Mars. Just a few words, not to win, just to last. He figured the gods were tired of hearing requests for glory. A little endurance felt more reasonable. Around him, others did the same. Quiet gestures, murmured dedications to Fortuna, Hercules, Apollo. One man muttered a charm to ward off the smell of wet wool. Possibly not divine, but practical. They dressed quickly, tunics, belts, worn sandals, some adjusted arm guards. Marcellus tied the strap on his left forearm 3 times before it held. His fingers had started shaking in the mornings, not out of fear, just repetition. The body remembering before the mind did. The call came from down the hall, a sharp bark in Latin. To the yard. No one rushed. There was no need. No one ever missed the training yard. Not twice. As they filed out, the cook handed each man a bowl. Breakfast, such as it was, meant barley mash, thick and sticky, like cement with ambition. A crust of bread and a sip of watered wine followed. The bread was hard enough to qualify as a weapon. Marcellus chewed slowly, letting the mush sit heavy in his mouth. It wasn't good, but it wasn't nothing. The body needed fuel. The mind could complain later. He sat on a low stone bench beneath the open sky, eating without conversation. The others did the same, some with heads bowed, 1 or 2 with eyes closed, as if dreaming of roasted boar or warm figs, or just home, somewhere nearby. A pigeon cooed, probably the only living creature in Rome less ambitious than they were. It waddled past Marcellus's sandal, paused, then pecked half-heartedly at a crumb. He nodded at it. Trade places? The bird blinked once and flew away. Didn't think so. The bell rang. Once. Long and low. That was the signal. The yard waited. Marcellus stood. Bowl empty. Belt tightened. Shoulders squared. There would be wooden swords, splinters, bruises, and the dry taste of dust. But for now, there was morning light, and the day was just beginning. The training yard stretched wide and open beneath the morning sun, its packed sand already warm beneath the sandals of a dozen men filing into place. It wasn't quite silence. The low creak of leather, the mutter of instructors, the scrape of wood, but it was something close. Marcellus stepped into the light and squinted. The sun was higher now, just past the roofs of the surrounding barracks, casting long, sharp shadows across the sand. A breeze moved through the air, lazy and half-committed. It did nothing to cool the heat rising from the ground. He took his place among the others, his feet settling into familiar grooves in the dirt. Not the exact ones from yesterday, but close. The same few meters of ground, worn and pounded by hundreds of mornings just like this one. An instructor barked a short command. Marcellus raised his rudis, a wooden practice sword, and moved into position. Left foot forward, shield up, shoulders relaxed but alert. The stance had been beaten into him, quite literally, months ago. Now it lived somewhere deeper than memory, closer to instinct. The first drill began. Forward, strike, retreat. Again, and again, and again. The wooden sword cracked against the padded post, sending a puff of dust into the air. Step back, reset, step forward, strike. Again. All around him, the same rhythm echoed, a chorus of effort and wood on wood. The yard sang in thuds and grunts. It wasn't about speed, or even strength. It was about rhythm, balance, repetition until the mind gave up and the body carried on without it. One man to his left dropped his shield mid-turn. The instructor appeared instantly, snatching it off the ground and shoving it back into his hands with a look that translated roughly to, "If you do that in the arena, don't bother picking it up." Marcellus kept moving. Forward, strike, back, reset, forward, strike. The sun climbed. The sand began to reflect it upward, baking from both directions. Sweat began to bead under his armour, then trickle down his back. His hands gripped the rudis tighter, the grain of the wood digging into his palm. Beside him, a younger recruit was visibly wilting, swaying slightly with each motion like a tree too stubborn to fall. He blinked hard, then leaned over and whispered, "Remind me why we didn't pick the Navy." Marcellus didn't answer, mostly because he was busy breathing. Also because the Navy involved drowning, which he wasn't particularly fond of either. They continued. Hours blurred into sets. Movements bled together. Instructors circled like hawks, calling out corrections, praising no one. Dust clung to their legs, turned to mud by sweat. At some point, a whistle blew. The rhythm broke. The men stepped back, breathing hard. Marcellus rolled his shoulders and let the sword drop for a moment, its weight hanging from his fingertips. He looked down at the sand and thought, briefly, about how many men had trained on this very ground, how many had survived, how many had not. He took a breath and looked up again. The next set of drills would begin soon. Sword and shield work, group rotations, dodging, rolling, recovery, and by the end of it, he would no longer remember what his feet felt like. But for now, he had a moment, just one, to straighten his back, stretch his neck, and whisper something only half sarcastic. Surely the gods will give me points for consistency. The breeze returned, just for a second. Then it left again, as if embarrassed by the effort. The instructor raised his hand. The rhythm was about to begin again. The instructor's hand came down, and the drills resumed like a wheel catching in its groove. The men moved forward, swords lifted, shoulders rotating, dust swirling at their ankles. But now, the rhythm slowed, the corrections grew sharper, because he had arrived. The doctor. He moved along the edge of the yard like a quiet shadow, neither hurried nor relaxed, just inevitable. His name was not often spoken, but when it was, it came with straightened backs and suddenly alert stances. He wore no armour, carried no weapon. He didn't need either. His presence was its own discipline. Marcellus noticed him out of the corner of his eye. Not panic, just focus. The doctor had once been a champion of the arena. That much was clear in the way he walked, with the balance of a man who still knew how to dodge a blade even in his sleep. He said little, but when he did, it cut deeper than any sparring sword. He paused behind a recruit who turned too wide in his strike. The doctor didn't shout. He didn't need to. Just 2 words. Too slow. The recruit nodded and adjusted. No excuse. No apology. That wasn't the way. Marcellus kept moving through his pattern. Strike. Roll. Guard. Again. The doctor watched him, silent, then gave the faintest nod, barely more than a shift of breath. It was the closest thing to praise anyone ever received. He moved on, correcting a stance here, a grip there, occasionally stopping a drill completely and taking the weapon in hand himself, showing slowly, precisely, the way it should be done. Watching the doctor fight was like watching a lion nap. You didn't want to wake it, but it was still magnificent. A wooden blade cracked against a practice shield nearby, too loud, too hard. The doctor was there instantly. No rage, no noise. You're not men anymore. You're weapons, and weapons don't shout. The recruit lowered his eyes and reset his stance. The sun rose higher, casting short shadows now. The heat clung to them, tightening across backs and necks like invisible chains. They kept moving. Mistakes were corrected. Posture was fixed. No one was praised. But no one fell either. The doctor circled once more before stopping beneath the shade of a stone awning. He crossed his arms and called out, "Enough?" No one hesitated. Swords dropped, shields lowered, knees shook, but no one collapsed. Not yet. The men gathered near the water trough, ladling cool water into their hands, onto their faces, drinking in short bursts as the dust caked at their throats. Marcellus leaned on the edge of the trough and exhaled. He didn't speak, just listened to the quiet breathing of the others, the flap of linen in the wind. He looked down at his reflection in the water, sweat-matted hair, dust on his cheeks, a trickle of blood from a scrape he hadn't noticed. It was a face still his. The bell rang again. Not the high ring of drills, a lower tone. The call for sparring, and sparring meant real contact, real bruises. No more drills, no more wooden posts that didn't swing back. Marcellus straightened and wiped a hand across his brow. The sweat smeared the dust rather than clearing it. But he didn't try again. Some battles weren't worth fighting. The men filed toward the practice arena, a wide, oval pit of deep-packed sand surrounded by a short stone wall. No seats, no crowd. Just the sound of sandals scraping the dirt and the occasional grunt of someone realizing they left their good shield back at the cell. Pairs were called out 2 at a time. The doctor read the names from memory. He never forgot. He didn't need parchment. Just a face, a flaw, and a voice that carried like iron. Marcellus, Tiro. Marcellus stepped forward, shield in hand, Rudy's tucked against his side. Tiro was already waiting, taller, younger, a little too confident in the way he spun his practice sword once before gripping it properly. Marcellus said nothing. The ones who spun their swords were usually the first to drop them. They entered the ring and faced each other, feet shoulder-width apart, shields raised. No announcement, no signal, only the doctor's voice. "Begin." Tiro moved quickly, lunging with a sharp strike toward Marcellus's side. Marcellus shifted his weight and caught it on the edge of his shield. The blow thudded against wood, echoed up his arm, but didn't break through. He stepped back, another swing, this one high. He ducked and swept low with his sword, tapping Tiro's knee. A point, if anyone was counting, which no one was. The fight continued, not fast, not flashy, just clean, efficient movements. Advance, block, sidestep, strike. Sand kicked up with every pivot. Breath came harder now and sticking in the throat. Tiro's swings grew heavier, sloppier. Marcellus kept his stance narrow, low. He knew better than to swing wildly. He could feel the sweat in his eyes now, stinging slightly. His arms ached. But this was the good kind of ache. The kind earned from knowing you hadn't made a mistake yet. They circled once more, and then a stumble. Tiro overreached on a strike, and Marcellus saw the gap. He stepped in, pressed his shield into Tiro's chest, and with a careful motion slid the edge of his rudis against his opponent's side. It would have been a finishing blow. They both froze. Tiro looked down at the wooden blade resting lightly against his ribs, then up at Marcellus. "Lucky shot," he said, catching his breath. Marcellus raised an eyebrow. "If you call standing upright and breathing luck, then yes." They stepped apart. The doctor gave a short nod and called the next pair. Tiro moved off, muttering something about sweaty palms. Marcellus didn't bother replying. He'd heard better excuses, and made a few himself, though none had ever helped the bruises afterward. He leaned against the low wall, watching the next set of fighters square off. Each strike they threw landed with a thud. The kind of sound you could feel in your ribs even if it didn't hit you, all around the pit. Others waited their turn, some stretching, others quietly hoping their name had been forgotten. Marcellus closed his eyes for a moment. The sun pressed down hard now, straight overhead. The sand radiated heat through his soles. His back was sore. His knuckles ached. But his heart was quiet. This wasn't glory. It wasn't fame. It wasn't even winning. It was surviving. Another breath. Another nod. Another morning with his name still known. Somewhere the doctor called out again. Another pair stepped forward. The wheel turned. Marcellus opened his eyes. Lunch would come soon. The sun sank slowly, like it too had grown tired of the day. By the time Marcellus walked back toward the barracks, the shadow stretched long across the sand, reaching out like arms in mid-yawn. The yard was quiet now. No more shouting, no more whistles, just the shuffle of sore feet and the soft clink of weapons being set aside for the night. He rolled his shoulder as he walked. A dull throb echoed beneath the joint, a gift from the morning shield drills. His forearm bore a faint red line. Not deep, just enough to remember. That was the thing about sparring. The good hits never left marks, but the bad ones left memories. Inside the barracks, the air was thick and still. Oil lamps flickered in shallow iron sconces, painting the walls in waves of yellow light. The smell of sweat, smoke, and the warm bread hung in the room like a tired sigh. Dinner was already waiting, a loaf of flatbread thick with coarse grain, and a small bowl of lentils that tasted like they'd seen better days. Not that anyone complained. Complaints didn't fill your stomach. Bread did. Marcellus sat on his usual bench, back against the stone wall, legs stretched out just far enough to feel rebellious. He tore off a piece of bread and dipped it into the lentils. The flavour was earthy. That was the polite word. The impolite word was mud adjacent. Across the table, a veteran named Felix sniffed his bowl and muttered, "This is the same stew they served last week, I can tell. I named one of the beans." Marcellus smirked but didn't respond. Talking too much made the food taste worse somehow. They ate in a kind of worn silence, not heavy, just practiced. A dozen men chewing in rhythm, each lost in his own thoughts, his own bruises, his own guesses about tomorrow. A low hum drifted from the far end of the room. One of the younger men had started singing to himself, barely more than a whisper. It wasn't a song anyone knew, but it didn't matter. It had a beat. And the beat felt familiar. Marcellus leaned back and let his head rest against the wall. The stone was cool, the bread was warm, and the day was nearly over. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, just to soften the light. A thought came, quiet and uninvited. Tomorrow would be different. Not just drills, not just sparring. He'd seen the doctor's list, pinned quietly to the wooden door of the armory. He hadn't meant to look, but he had, and his name had been there, on the right side. The side that wasn't for training. He breathed out through his nose, not fear, not yet, just awareness, like the sound of distant thunder before you've seen the clouds. He finished the last bite of bread and set the bowl aside. The room was dimmer now. A few men had already slipped into their cells, boots left neatly by the door, armour hung from hooks. Marcellus stood, stretched once more, a long, low groan of a movement, and made his way down the corridor. His feet dragged slightly, not from weakness, but from routine. The door to his cell creaked as he opened it. The mat was still there, the spider too, still hanging in its corner. He nodded at it. Still here? Good. I'll need someone to cheer for me. He didn't expect a reply, of course. The spider had standards. Marcellus sat down slowly, unlaced his sandals, and lay back onto the mat. His body was sore, his stomach full, his mind quiet. The night air drifted in through the barred window, cool and dry. Somewhere far off, a dog barked. Or maybe it was laughter. Rome blurred like that sometimes. He stared up at the ceiling, watching the shadows shift with the flicker of the torchlight outside. And as his eyes began to close, one thought came again, not loud, not urgent, just present. Tomorrow would not be the same. The night passed. Marcellus woke before the light, not with a start, not from a sound, just a slow stirring, as if something had quietly nudged his soul and whispered, "It's time." He lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling. The spider was gone. That somehow made the room feel emptier. The air was colder than usual, not by much, just enough to notice. Just enough to remind him that the world today was not the same one he fell asleep in. He sat up. His body resisted, every muscle pulling against the movement like it had something better to do. His knees ached. His back popped. His breath left him in a soft groan. Not pain, just acknowledgement. Outside, the corridor was still. No footsteps, no voices. Only the faint creak of the torch brackets swaying slightly in the early chill. Marcellus dressed in silence. Not the tunic today. Laid out across the bench beside his mat was his gear. Real gear. Polished greaves, a heavier belt, a proper shield, a gladius. The real thing. Not the carved wooden echo he'd trained with for so long. The blade gleamed in the low light. Still clean. Still untouched. He stared at it for a moment, then picked it up. It was heavier than he remembered. Or maybe he was just older than he thought. He buckled on the armour slowly, not from hesitation, just care. You didn't rush the little things on days like this. The leather straps were stiff, the metal cool against his skin. The helmet rested on the bench, quiet and waiting, like it knew the ending but wasn't going to spoil it. When he stepped out into the corridor, he noticed the silence. not absence of sound. This was different. It was the kind of quiet that pressed against your chest, that made you feel like the world had paused just long enough to let you understand it. A few other men passed by, some nodded, some didn't. There were no jokes this morning, no sparring bravado, just walking. The mess hall was dim. Breakfast was waiting. Bread again, some cheese, a touch of watered wine. Marcellus sat across from Felix, who took one look at the helmet under his arm and sighed. "If it's your last meal," asked the cook for something less symbolic. Marcellus smirked. "Like what?" Felix shrugged. "I don't know. An egg?" They ate without rush. The bread was slightly less stale today. A small kindness. The cheese, however, was doing an impression of a brick and doing it convincingly. He didn't finish the wine. When the bell rang, a single, deep note. Marcellus stood. He placed his bowl gently on the table, lifted his helmet, and walked to the outer yard. There, beneath a low stone arch, stood the doctor, not barking orders today, just waiting. Marcellus approached. The trainer nodded once and handed him a small cloth bag. Inside, a handful of ash, charcoal, war paint of sorts. He stepped aside to a basin of water, dipped his fingers in the ash, and drew 2 marks down his face. One across the brow, one across the cheek. Not a superstition, just a ritual. A way of saying to the body, this is different. Pay attention. Across the yard, 2 servants waited with the gate open, the gate that led down beneath the arena into the holding cells below, the entrance to the world where practice ended and everything else began. Marcellus turned back for a moment. The sky was pale now, a soft, washed-out grey. A single bird flitted past the rooftops, calling once, then vanishing. He took a breath and walked forward. The gate closed behind him with the quiet finality of a decision made. The path beneath the arena sloped downward, carved from ancient stone worn smooth by the weight of countless footsteps, most of them barefoot, many of them final. Marcellus walked slowly, his armour creaking softly with each step. The air grew cooler as he descended, tinged with the smell of oil, rusted iron, and the faint dampness of earth that hadn't seen sunlight in centuries. At the bottom, the corridor opened into a holding chamber, a wide, low room lit by wall torches and heavy with quiet breath. A few other men were already there, seated along the perimeter, sharpening blades, adjusting straps, or simply staring at the ground. No one spoke. No one needed to. The room wasn't silent because of nerves. It was silent because they had all been here before, in one way or another. Some had fought, some had watched, all had waited. Marcellus moved to a bench in the corner and set down his shield. He leaned his gladius against the wall, then removed his helmet and let it rest beside him. For now, he needed to breathe. A servant approached, one of the arena attendants, dressed in a tunic dyed deep red and carrying a small clay bowl of oil and ash. He bowed slightly before kneeling and, with 2 fingers, began to smear thin lines across Marcellus's shoulders and chest. The mixture was warm, and it smelled of cedar and smoke. It wasn't for the gods exactly, it was for the crowd. The markings caught the torchlight, gave shape to the muscles, made the fighter look less like a man and more like a story. Marcellus didn't flinch as the fingers worked across old scars, around bruises from training. He stared ahead, eyes unfocused, breath even. The servant finished and wiped his hands on a cloth, then reached for a final item, a small bronze clasp in the shape of a lion's head. He handed it to Marcellus without a word. A small token, nothing official, just a weight to carry into the sand. Marcellus turned it in his hand. It was cold, heavy for its size. He tucked it into the leather strap across his chest and exhaled. Another fighter, seated nearby, glanced over and nodded. He had a long scar down his arm and a face that looked like it had seen several lifetimes compressed into one. "First match?" he asked. Marcellus hesitated, then nodded. The man smiled faintly. "Keep your chin tucked, and don't trip on your own shield. It ruins the whole dramatic effect." Marcellus returned the smile, just barely. "Noted." The torchlight flickered across the stone walls. A distant rumble came from above, the sound of a crowd shifting in their seats, murmuring, waiting, not roaring, not yet, but close. A horn sounded, a single, low note that rattled through the stone and made every man in the room straighten his back slightly. Marcellus stood, helmet on, gladius in hand, shield tightened, one breath in, one out. A final glance around the chamber. The faces of men who knew the rhythm, who knew the weight of every step ahead. And then, as he turned toward the archway that led into the light, he muttered softly, "If I trip out there, tell them it was on purpose." No one laughed, but someone snorted. Close enough. He stepped into the tunnel. It curved upward now, the incline steep but manageable, the light at the end growing with every step. The sound of the crowd grew louder, still just murmurs, but layered now with expectation, like the breath before a storm, or a prayer. Marcellus didn't rush. He walked like he was part of the stone, carved forward by something older than thought, and when he reached the end, just before stepping out, he paused. One last moment in the shade, the edge of the world, and then the sun. The sun hit his armour like a silent drum, bright and hot, even through the polished bronze. But Marcellus didn't step into the arena just yet. Not yet. He stood at the edge, a narrow platform beneath the amphitheatre wall, tucked just out of sight from the crowd, behind a thick wooden gate carved with marks older than he was. This was the holding space. The breath before the sentence. The silence before the name. The arena floor lay ahead, wide and golden. Sand raked smooth, flat and flawless. Too flawless, like a clean sheet before a messy letter. Marcellus rested his shield against the wall and sat down on a worn wooden bench. It had been used by hundreds before him, each one waiting, wondering, wishing, or not. A small table beside him held a water skin, half full. He took a sip. It was lukewarm and slightly metallic, exactly how nervous tasted. Across the gate, on the opposite side, the other fighter would be waiting too. He didn't know who it was. Sometimes they told you, sometimes they didn't. It didn't really matter. The matchmakers chose opponents like a butcher chose cuts of meat, with purpose, but not poetry. He stretched out his legs. His calves were tight, his shoulders stiff, but nothing felt off. No weakness, no trembling, just the usual hum beneath the skin. A young boy, maybe 10, passed by the corridor above, holding a bundle of feathers for sweeping the entry steps. He caught sight of Marcellus and paused, wide-eyed. "Are you scared?" he asked. Marcellus looked up, thought for a moment, then replied, "A little, but mostly I'm just hoping I tied my belt tight enough." The boy blinked once, then smiled and disappeared behind the column. Marcellus exhaled through his nose. It wasn't a lie. The belt really was a little loose. Time passed strangely here. The arena buzzed above, voices multiplying as more spectators arrived. Still no trumpet, still no name. He looked down at the sand again. It seemed smaller now, more intimate, like it wasn't a battlefield, but a room. and everyone inside had agreed not to speak too loudly. His hand drifted to the lion head clasp on his strap. Still there. Still cold. He thought briefly about home. Not about a mother or a lover or a field of wheat. None of that. Just a small clay lamp. The one that used to sit on the table in the corner of a room he could barely remember. The light it gave off was orange and steady. It made shadows dance like friends. He remembered that more than names or faces or smells. Above a horn blew, not a long call, just a sharp note. It was time. The gate before him creaked as the latch was loosened from the other side. He stood, adjusted his grip on the Gladius, and slipped the helmet over his head. Everything narrowed. Sight, sound, purpose. The door didn't swing open all at once. It groaned slowly, or like a yawn, and then light. He stepped forward. The sun met him again, and this time it stayed. He then felt the sand. Warm, coarse, soft where it shouldn't be. It gave slightly beneath his steps, just enough to make each movement a small act of work. And above it all, the crowd. Thousands, maybe, lined along the stone tiers of the Colosseum, rising in wide, concentric rings like an open mouth. They weren't cheering, not yet. They were watching. Marcellus didn't look at them. There was no point. The crowd wasn't one thing. It was many. Eyes without faces, hands without names. He walked slowly toward the centre of the arena, his shield at his side. His gladius angled slightly down, not in fear, but in readiness. There was no ceremony, no trumpet. Just the echo of his own footsteps on packed earth, across the sand. The gate on the far side opened. His opponent stepped forward, a tall figure wrapped in layered leather and iron, carrying a curved blade and a rectangular shield. The armour style marked him as a Thraex, a Thracian-style fighter, agile and fast. Marcellus had trained with that type before. Not easy, not impossible, just tricky. The man's face was mostly hidden beneath his helmet, but his movements were loose, casual, the way a cat might stretch before deciding whether or not to chase something. They approached slowly, meeting at the centre. A brief nod, nothing more. Then space. The referee, robed in dark linen, silent and unsmiling, stepped to the edge and raised one hand. A long pause, and then he dropped it. The fight began. There was no sprint, no scream, just motion. Marcellus stepped left, keeping his shield angled toward the sun to reduce the glare. The Thraex mirrored him, blade twitching slightly in his hand like it was already bored. The first exchange came quick, a lunge, a twist, a scrape of steel on shield. No blood, no fall, just breath. They circled again. Marcellus tightened his grip. His legs bent slightly, adjusting to the softness of the sand. The Thraex feinted left, then struck low. Marcellus blocked. Barely, the impact rattling through his bones like a bell. A few murmurs rose from the crowd. Someone in the second tier clapped once, then seemed to think better of it. They moved again, closer now. Strike, block, shift. Marcellus aimed a cut to the side, missed, retreated. His opponent chuckled once, or maybe just coughed. It was hard to tell beneath the helmet. "I'll give you this," Marcellus muttered under his breath. "You're not in a rush." There was no reply. Just another blow. This one harder. It hit his shield at an awkward angle and made him stumble. Not fall, but enough to feel it in the knees. He backed up, reset his stance, tried not to show the shake in his elbow. They circled again, and again. Dust curled around their ankles, kicked up in slow clouds. The sun pressed down like a second shield, heavier, constant, indifferent. Time thinned. There were no rounds or no breaks. Just the space between two people and the moment one makes a mistake. And then, it came. Marcellus stepped in, not desperate, just decisive. A cut aimed for the exposed shoulder, but it was too high. The Thraex caught it, not with his blade, but with his movement, twisting, pivoting, and driving forward in the same breath. A blow landed, heavy, low, unavoidable. The crowd made a sound, not a cheer, not a gasp, just a sound. Marcellus felt his balance go. The world tilted slightly. And then, the sand was closer than it had been a moment ago. He was down, one knee in the dust, his shield half raised. He blinked. The sky looked wider from here. He tried to rise. His legs obeyed. Barely. The final strike wasn't loud. It didn't echo. It didn't ring. It just was. A pressure, a stillness, a silence. And then, nothing. And that was it. There was no thunder, no roar from the gods, no triumphant declaration. Marcellus lay where he had fallen, the sand already beginning to settle around him. His shield rested beside him, his hand still curled loosely around the hilt of the gladius. The blade no longer mattered. The shield didn't either. From the upper tiers, the crowd watched in that peculiar Roman way, part curiosity, part detachment. They weren't cruel, most of them, just distant, like people watching a fire burn that wasn't close enough to threaten their sandals. A few applauded, a few stood, most simply shifted in their seats, already thinking about what came next. Across the arena, the Thrax lowered his blade and turned. No celebration, no gesture. He walked slowly toward the gate, his breathing heavy but even, his armour dusted with fine powder from the arena floor. He passed the body of Marcellus without pause. Not from disrespect, from familiarity. This wasn't his first. It wouldn't be his last. The arena gate creaked open as he approached, and he stepped into the shadow without looking back. Behind him, attendants entered quietly. 2 men in plain tunics, dragging a cart. They moved without hurry, lifting the body of Marcellus onto the wooden platform with practiced care. One of them paused briefly, looking at the lion head clasp on his strap. "Looks expensive," he said. The other shrugged. If he didn't make it out, he probably didn't need it. They didn't laugh. But they didn't cry either. The cart rolled away. The gate closed. The sand was raked smooth again. In the barracks that evening, his name was mentioned once. Briefly. A younger recruit asked if anyone had seen him after lunch. Felix shook his head. "He's gone," he said. "Not cruelly, just plainly. He went out clean." That was enough. Later, another man arrived, a new one. He took Marcellus's cell without question, unrolled a mat, ate the same bread, did not notice the spider. And that was how it went. No songs, no statues, no words carved in stone. Just the dust settling, and another name, forgotten. The sun rose the next morning just as it always did, without permission, without fanfare. It slid quietly over the rooftops of Rome, brushed its light against stone pillars and terracotta tiles, warmed the streets, and crept across the sand of the empty arena. There were no signs left, no markings, no blood. The ground had been raked smooth, its surface clean and level, as if nothing had ever happened there at all. The crowd would return soon. They always did. Vendors would sell figs and honeyed nuts. Boys would race up the stairs with messages, and men in heavy robes would talk about politics while watching strangers bleed. But for now, the arena was quiet. A sparrow hopped across the southern ledge, pecked at something invisible, then took off again without urgency. Down below, the corridor beneath the stands echoed with footsteps, not heavy ones, just the slow shuffle of servants readying the holding room. Armour would be checked, water jars refilled, ropes tightened. Another day, another list, another name. In the barracks, men stirred on their straw mats. They groaned, stretched, rubbed their eyes. No one said good morning. That wasn't the kind of place this was. The new recruit, the one who took Marcellus's place, sat on the edge of the bed, tying the strap of his sandal. It was too tight. He pulled it looser, tried again. He hadn't met Marcellus, didn't know his voice, or the way he always left exactly 3 crumbs of bread on his plate. Didn't know about the spider, as didn't need to. The doctor passed down the corridor, calling out instructions. Drills would begin soon. The sun was already high enough to make the dust shimmer. Another day of movement. Another day of wooden swords, bruises, sweat, silence. And somewhere in the shadows the gate to the arena waited. Not open, not closed, just waiting. Rome did not stop. It never had. It never would. The names changed. The faces changed. The sand remained. And above it all, the world turned gently on its side, warmed by light, softened by distance, until eventually it too fell into silence.